Our speaker today is Annie Ellis. And Annie is down here, and she's about to come up here. So just checking that she was here before Annie is one of our clergy, and she's overseeing, she's the service pastor of our site at Courtfield Gardens. And so please will you give Annie a really, really warm welcome.
Good morning. It's lovely to be here with you at Brompton Road. Let me just get myself set up. There we are. Let me guess. You've been through some low moments in life. And when you've been sitting in the darkest place, you have had a well-meaning friend deliver this wonderful line. Oh, everything happens for a reason. And you thought, really? This happened for a reason? Because God, if this happened for a reason, if you, God, orchestrated this in my life, well, God, I just don't want to know you. I don't want a God who puts this in my life. I'm here to tell you this morning that God didn't plan your suffering. God is not a sadist who's smiling down whilst you are in pain. God hates injustice. And yet, because we live in a world that is broken, suffering is inevitable. Every person in this room and on this planet has either been through or will go through some major suffering. And today we're continuing our series in 2 Corinthians 4. Which is a letter written by somebody who experienced more suffering than most of us in this room. When Paul became a Christian, he lost his reputation and his status. He was beaten and imprisoned. He lost friendships. He struggled financially. And eventually he was killed for his faith. And he's writing to a church who've rejected him because of his suffering. They've said, look, Paul, we don't really want a pastor whose life is terrible. It's not very inspiring. It's not what we're aiming for, actually, Paul. Sorry. And so Paul has written back this letter, which we're reading today. 2 Corinthians 4 from verse 13 says this. It is written, I believed, and therefore I've spoken. And since we have that same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak. Because we know that the one who raised Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you to himself. All this is for your benefit, so that the grace that is reaching more and more people may cause thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. And I want to speak to you under this title, Finding God in Suffering. If I were to ask you, what's the best way to find God? Maybe you'd say, come with me to Brompton Road, 11:30 service. You'll find God there. Or maybe you'd say, you could pray, or you could read the Bible. I'll tell you what you wouldn't probably say. You should go through a lot of suffering, and then you'll find God. But in our passage, we find these 3 ways to encounter God, which are only available to us when we experience suffering. In Paul's letter, he's describing this strange paradox of the gospel. That in some sense, our suffering is actually the best vantage point to find God. So this is where we're going this morning. In suffering, you see God for who he truly is. In suffering, you see the world for what it really is. And in suffering, you speak to God honestly. So Paul says this: our troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs our troubles. And that word glory that he used comes from the Greek word doxa, which refers to the value that is ascribed to something or someone. So in the case of God, the glory of God refers to God's intrinsic and infinite value. It's the fact that God is always holy, just, loving, and kind. That God sees and knows everything, and that he's always in control. But in the New Testament, the word glory also has another meaning. It's used to refer to the brightness of the moon. It's used when angels appear and they're radiant and shiny. And it's used when Jesus goes up a mountain with his friends, and the account describes how he was transfigured before them. His face became radiant and shiny, and his clothes suddenly glowed bright white. So in some sense, God's glory seems to be shiny. Now, I own two very shiny things. Me and my husband, Ben, got married on Christmas Eve in 2020. And every day since then, I have worn my wedding ring and my engagement ring until the 7th of November last year, when I was standing in my sister-in-law's kitchen and I looked at my hand and I thought, where have I put my rings? I don't know why I'm not wearing them. We searched her house, her garden, our car, no rings. We came home and searched every nook and cranny in our house. We searched the fridge, the bin, the sock drawer, no rings. A few days goes by, a week goes by, a month goes by, no rings. And I'm feeling awful. My husband's bought me this lovely gift, and I've lost it. They're obviously the most expensive item that I own, but more so, they have a huge significance to us. They're valuable because of what they mean to me and my husband. But then, a month later, Saturday, the 7th of December, my sister-in-law and her husband and her kids go round to their neighbour's Christmas party. And it's in the middle of Storm Dara, so it's awful weather. And this other neighbour bounces into the party and announces to everyone, "Hey everyone, my wheelie bin has blown over in the storm, and underneath it I found this ring." Another neighbour pipes up and says, "No, I've seen that ring on the street before, and it's actually just a plastic child's ring." So strangely, the first guy thinks, okay, I'll just go and put it back where I found it. And so he puts it back underneath the wheelie bin. Nobody thought anything of it from my family until they're walking home and my 8-year-old niece, B, says to her mum, "Mum, don't you think that might be Auntie Annie's ring? Let's go and look under the wheelie bin." And under the wheelie bin, lo and behold, there's my engagement ring and my wedding ring. They're covered in mud, the metal is bent, and the diamond is still there, but it's just hanging out of the clasp at an angle. I thought they were lost. And then when we found them, I thought they were ruined. But they're at the jeweler's right now, and the jeweler tells me that they're looking as good as new, shiny and radiant. The value and significance of those rings has remained, despite what they've been through. When Jesus stood on that mountain, and he was bright white and shiny, his friends became convinced that he was indeed the Messiah. Surely this is what a king looks like, they thought. But it wasn't long until he was on not a mountain, but a hill, hung up on a cross. And those same friends looked at him and they freaked out. They ran away. Surely this shouldn't happen to a king. But here's the truth. A diamond is still a diamond, even when it's covered in mud. And God's glory remains, whether he's shiny on a hill or on a cross, hanging. So that's the first way that you can find God in times of suffering. You become aware that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And whatever you're facing, you can know this today. You are still God's handiwork. You are still chosen and called by God. He's died and raised to life for you. And if you choose to accept him, he will fill you with his Spirit, which is an eternal glory that is set to remain. So the second way that you can find God in times of suffering is that in suffering, you see the world for what it really is. So about a year ago, I had a baby. Her name's Lara. She's delightful. But a few months into having a baby, I found myself starting to feel quite anxious. And the reason why is because I realized that Lara has this whole life ahead of her. And I don't know the ways in which she's going to suffer. But the truth is that I know she will. I began to feel anxious as we got in the car, worrying that someone would crash into us. I would feel anxious when I took her to the swimming pool. I would feel anxious about her future, things that are way out of my hands, things that I can't control. And there are certain moments and times in life where you become acutely aware of the dark reality of life. I wonder when that's happened for you. Perhaps it's when you've lost a job. Maybe it's when your marriage broke down or when you got rejected by someone that you wanted to date. Maybe it's when you experienced discrimination or you got cancelled. Maybe it's when you made a huge mistake at work and you couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe it's when you realized that waiting for a baby was taking longer than you thought. Perhaps something happened in the news that terrified you. When you encounter deep pain and suffering, you will find that you cry out to God in the same words that Jesus used on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And when you come to that point, you have two options. The first is that that's the end of your journey with God. And that's the option that many people choose because it feels too painful to come to God in that moment when he's allowed this to happen. But there is another option. You can choose to look for a God who himself has been through deep suffering, sees what you're going through, cares for you, and commits to walk with you through it. There was a 20th century German theologian called Jürgen Moltmann. And during the Second World War, he was held in a prisoner of war camp in the UK. After the war, he returned to Germany to study theology. And this is what he described. Shattered and broken, the survivors of my generation were returning from camps and hospitals to the lecture room. A theology which didn't speak of God in the sight of the one who was abandoned and crucified would have had nothing to say to us then. Those prisoners of war found that it didn't make sense to believe in a good God unless he was one who had entered into human suffering. But perhaps you're here today and you'd say, but Annie, are you just saying that our faith is just a crutch used by sad people to make themselves feel a little bit better about the world? Well, the world is more broken than we in the West tend to think. And when you experience suffering firsthand, you experience the reality and truth of the world in a way that you didn't before. When your life is going great, the death of Jesus on a cross looks unattractive and frankly unnecessary. Why would I want to follow a crucified God when I could go for brunch with the gals? But there's a reason why Jesus says it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's because our comfort and our riches get in the way of us understanding the true reality of life. But when your life isn't going so great, you find that you long for it to be true, that death could turn to life. And you know that you can't do that yourself. So to answer your question, is it a crutch? Well, I know I need some help, but a crutch wouldn't be enough. God says that the level of suffering, sin, and brokenness in the world is so great that it would take something huge to set it right. It would take the death of Jesus on the cross, who takes all of our sin, pain, and suffering upon himself. And what it means is that you are valuable enough to God. You matter, and your suffering matters enough to God that he would do that for you. And you can choose today to put your faith in that crucified God. And the promise is this, that as Jesus died on that cross, you, in all of your pain, brokenness, and suffering, also died. And he promises that we will be raised to life with him too. So in our suffering, we see the world for how it really is, and we see God for how he really is. And finally, in our suffering, we find that we can speak to God with honesty. So my daughter Lara is now 1, and she absolutely loves food. If her food isn't being delivered quick enough, she lets me know. I used to think that she knew the word mama because she would sort of say mama and look at me. But now I realize that the word mama to her just means anything she wants. She'll point out a banana and say, mama. The thing is, babies communicate what they want and need. It's only when we get a little bit older and we start to think, I should probably be a bit more socially acceptable. And in our passage, Paul invites us to be honest. He writes this, I believed, therefore I have spoken. And he's assuming that his readers would know that this is a phrase from Psalm 116, which is a prayer written by somebody who is deeply suffering. When you read through the Psalms, you find that every emotion and every question is included. More than half of the Psalms are lament Psalms. They're written by people who were, frankly, depressed. And I don't know how you feel about bringing your questions and your concerns to God. Perhaps you feel guilty about the thought of saying to God that you doubt his goodness. Perhaps you feel too angry to speak to him. Perhaps you're confused about why your prayers weren't answered. Perhaps you feel so full of sorrow that there are no words to say to him. There's a theologian called Walter Brueggemann who's in his 90s, and he wrote this a couple of years ago. Some strands of piety will think that the faithful should not talk in this honest way, and certainly not in the presence of the Holy One. But behind that is the notion that the faithful should not think or feel in this way either. But we do. What is felt and thought must be said. It must be said out loud, and it must be said out loud in the presence of God. This is the God from whom no secret can be hid. So I wonder what it would look like for you to be honest before God today. Are there parts of your life that you've been hiding from him because you felt too ashamed? Is there something that God's calling you to that you've said, no, God, I'm too inadequate for that? Would you dare to say yes today? Or is there something that you need to ask God for help with? Will you lay down your ego and ask him? And will you be honest before others? When I first started going to church, I was at university, and there were lots of things that I loved about being in that church. There were lots of young adults, and I'd never met young Christians before. People were worshiping God so excited and full of faith, and I loved it. I'd never seen that before either. And so I decided that I would join a small group. But I only went to my small group twice. Everyone in the group was lovely, but I felt that they were all so much more holy than me. Their lives were so together, I thought. They wouldn't want me to bring my questions, my thoughts, my doubts. And I definitely didn't want to tell them about my actual life outside of church. I thought they would definitely judge me. Some years later, I ended up doing Alpha here at HTB, and I found myself in a small group where, as we chatted, I found myself sharing about my real life, the things that had happened, the way I felt. And I found that I was able to be honest before God too. And as it happened, the Christians in my group, well, they were kind. They weren't judgmental. Can I encourage you? It might feel hard to share the things in your life that you're ashamed of, that are painful, but it's worth it. It's not worth living your life with some pretense that you're better than you are. God can only transform your heart when you come to him in honesty. And God promises that in our weakness, he fills us with his Spirit. So that's the third way that you can find God in suffering: becoming honest with God and with others. As I come into land, let me draw your attention to one last thing in our passage. We're so aware that life is short. We know that 100% of people will die. And Paul puts it pretty bluntly for us. What is seen is temporary. Our suffering is temporary. Now, our bookshelf at home is full of intellectually stimulating, very interesting books, and I have one here that I think you might like. It's called The Three Little Pigs. Now, you might know it. It's a story about three pigs, and they each decide to build a house. One of them builds a house out of straw, one out of wood, and one out of bricks. But there's a nasty wolf who comes along. And this wolf goes and knocks on the door of the straw house and says, little pig, won't you let me come in?" And the pig says, "No, not by the hairs on my chinny chin chin," obviously. And the wolf then says, "Well, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down." And so he blows the house down and the little pig runs away. Although I do think that is probably an aspect of the fairy tale where, they've made it nice for kids. Did that pig not get eaten? I think he did. But the same thing happens to the second pig. He runs away too. But the third little pig lives in a safe and secure home where nasty wolves can try, but there's no way that house is getting blown down. Now, I wonder if whoever had written that fairy tale was reading our passage for today. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in gets destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. I don't know about you, but I find it hard to imagine what it would be like to feel truly safe from harm, to have no fear of death. But we have this longing inside of us. C.S. Lewis puts it like this: all your life, an unattainable ecstasy has hovered just outside of the grasp of your consciousness. To feel safe and secure in heaven. Would you imagine with me for a moment? Years from now, each of us stands in God's house. We've endured the sufferings that life has thrown at us, and we've chosen to put our faith in Jesus. In our most downtrodden moments of life, people around us saw the radiant glory of God living in us, and they chose to invite that radiant glory into their lives too. We didn't have to look impressive or be something we were not. And now, we stand in God's eternal house. We are safe and protected, full of his glory. And it's more majestic and beautiful than any of us could ever have imagined or described. We found God. Amen. we're going to pray. So would you like to stand if you're able? You might like to draw to mind a couple of the things that you know you'd like to hold before God. The honest parts of your life. The deep wounds. And I'm going to pray and invite the Holy Spirit to come and minister to us. Come, Holy Spirit. We invite your presence to come and draw near to us. Wash over us by your Spirit. We invite you into the deepest parts of our lives, Lord. The areas that we tend to prefer to tuck away. The things that feel too painful. Lord, come and draw near.